Okay, friends, today we're going to look at a very, very famous passage of Scripture, often called the feeding of the 5,000, covering the Scriptures from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21, where these events of the feeding of this multitude of people are used to demonstrate both the compassion and the miraculous power of Christ. So we're going to do, as we always do, I'm going to start off by reading you the actual scriptures themselves, and then we'll come back and we'll just do an exposition and work our way through them and look at what they're saying and what they might be telling us. So picking up the text in verse 13, it says this: "When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go to the village and buy themselves food.' And Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, 'Bring them here to me.' And he commanded the multitude to sit down in the grass. And then he took 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children." You know, Galilee at the time of Jesus must have been a place where it was very difficult to find some time to be alone. You see, it was a small country, a small region, only 50 miles from north to south and 25 miles east to west at its widest point. And the Roman historian Josephus tells us that at this time, within that small area, there were 204 towns and villages, none of whom had a population of less than 15,000 people, which meant in many ways it had a similar population as that entire region has today. It was such a thickly populated area, it was not easy to get away from the people for any length of time. But it was known to be quieter on the other side, the far side of the lake. Now at the widest point, this lake was 8 miles wide. And Jesus and his friends, they were of course fishermen, his disciples were fisherfolk, so they decided that they would embark on one of the boats and that they would seek a place of quietness and rest on the east side of the lake. And this is what Jesus was seen to be doing, following on from having heard of the death of John. Not surprisingly, really, that he might want to go off and be himself for a period of quiet and contemplation at these traumatic events that had just transpired. I think there are several simple reasons and natural reasons why Jesus would want to seek to be alone at this point. In his humanity, he may just have needed rest. He was someone who never recklessly ran towards danger, and of course opposition was beginning to arise, and he was now beginning to try and withdraw himself from that opposition, lest he too, I suppose, should share the fate of John too early in his ministry. And most of all, with the awareness of the cross figuring nearer and nearer, Jesus knew that he must meet with God before he met with men. So he went seeking rest for his body and strength for his soul in the lonely places. But as I said, in that highly populated region, it would not have been easy to find a place of peace. People, of course, would immediately see a boat set sail, and they could very soon work out where it was going, and that is what indeed happened here. The crowds, we are told, they flock around the top edge of the lake, and they're waiting for him on the other side when he arrives. So Jesus gets to this point, is greeted by the multitude, and of course, he does what he always does. He ministers to them, he heals them. And by the time evening come, the people are getting hungry, and how will he feed them before they take the long road home again? This is where this feeding of the 5,000 miracles is described. And few of Jesus' miracles are so revealing of him and his ministry and his purpose as this one. This miracle tells us several things. Firstly, it of course demonstrates for us the compassion of Jesus. When he saw the crowds, it tells us he was moved with compassion to the depths of his heart. This is a very beautiful thing. Jesus had come to find peace and quiet and loneliness, and instead he found a vast crowd eagerly demanding what he and they believed only he could give to them. Now, he might easily, in human terms, have resented them for that. What right had they to force themselves on him again, to invade his privacy when he had tried to withdraw and to make continual demands? Was he to have no rest and quiet and no time to himself at all? But Jesus was not like that. So far from finding them a nuisance, he was moved with compassion for them. As in these days of old, so as today, the Christian message to non-Christians, to the non-Christian world, has always been the eternal message that God cares. And if that's so, we too, like Christ, must never be seen to be too busy for people. We must never seem to find them a trouble and a nuisance. Those inquirers were lost and might never return again. We must never deal with people with one eye on the clock, as if we're anxious to be rid of them as soon as we can. My father, during the 1940s, 50s, right up to the end of the 1970s, he travelled and spent a lot of time in India. And there is a account somewhere I heard him or someone else talking about the very first Metropolitan Bishop of India and how he refused to meet someone called Pandit Iswar Chandra, who had an important leadership position in the region of Bengal. Pandit Chandra was seen by many as a spokesman of the Hindu community in the Calcutta area, as it was called at that time, and to establish friendly relationships with the bishop and with the Christian church establishing that area. He and another chap called Vidsegar, who was founder of a Hindu college in Calcutta and was a well-known social reformer, author and educationalist, attempted to meet with the then bishop, who wouldn't give them the time to meet. They travelled, in fact, to meet with him, but they returned disappointed. They weren't even granted an interview. And in response to that, they formed a strong party and rallied round them a group of educated, wealthy citizens of Calcutta whose position was to actively oppose the church and the bishop and to guard against what they saw as the spread of Christianity. Someone later observed that the bishop had turned a potential friend into a foe. What an opportunity for Christ was lost at that time, because someone would not even let their privacy and their busyness of their everyday life as they saw it invaded unless a meeting was arranged in advance through official channels. In spite of the fact that these men had travelled a great time on spec of seeing them, he did not meet with them. Jesus never found a person a nuisance in that way. Even when his whole being was crying out for rest and quiet, as it must surely have been here, he carried on. And I suppose that tells us, as followers, that must be our inspiration, and our motivation should be to do the same. Also in this story, we see Jesus witnessing that all gifts are from God. He took food and he said a blessing. Now, the Jewish grace before the meals at that time was very simple. They simply said, "Blessed art thou, Jehovah our God, King of the universe, who brings forth the bread from the earth." Many believe that that would have been the grace which Jesus would have said here, for that was the grace which every Jewish family used and every group of Jewish people would say before a meal. But in it we see Jesus simply showing that it is God's gifts which bring to men and women everything that we have. The level of grace or gratitude is rare enough in a relationship towards other men, and it is rarer still that people will show it towards God even for the simplest things in life. I believe this passage also gives us an insight into the place of a disciple in the work of Christ. It creates a model by which we can follow and measure ourselves. The miracle informs us very clearly of the place of disciples in the work of Christ, in participating in the ministry and work of Christ. The story tells us that Jesus gave to the disciples, and the disciples then gave it to the crowd. Jesus, you see, worked through his followers. He did it on that day, and I would suggest he still does it that way today. Again and again, we always come face to face with the truth, both in the New Testament, but also in the heart of any true, active, living Christian community, is that the disciples are called to do the work of the Lord. In fact, that the disciple, the Christian disciple, is helpless without his Lord and without his ministry of doing his will. Which the other side of that coin would suggest that maybe God, in some respects, is helpless in bringing about his plan into the people that you know if you're not willing to be his disciple and work to fulfill his will in their lives. If Jesus wanted something done then and today, he needs his disciples to be willing to do it. If he wants a child taught or a person helped, he needs a man or woman to do it. He needs people through whom he can not only speak, but through whom he can act. Jesus needs disciples through whom he can work and through whom his love and his truth can enter into the lives of others. He needs men and women to whom he can give gifts in order that they can share them with others. Without such people, he cannot get things done, and it is our task to be such people of God for him, people that he can use. Now, it could be easy to be daunted and discouraged by the magnitude of some of the tasks we might face, but look at this story, because this is another way in which this story may encourage us. When Jesus told the disciples to feed the crowd, all they had was 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and yet with that and what they had brought before him, Jesus was able to bless it and bring the required task to fruition. And Jesus would do this by a miracle. Jesus, in a sense, sets every one of us tremendous tasks of communicating himself to other people. But he does not demand from us abilities that we do not possess, or gifts that we do not have, or that he can utilize. He simply says to us, come to me as you are. However ill-equipped you might feel, bring to me what you have. However small it is, I will be able to take it and use it greatly in my service. You know, even the smallest of things, the littlest of giftings, is always and will always be enough to fulfill God's will in the service of Christ. At the end of this miracle, there's a strange little touch, and I think one that provides a teachable moment in the modern times of environmental waste and mismanagement. Did you notice the fragments are all gathered up? Even when a miracle could feed these people generously, there was still no waste. There's something really, I think, to take note of here. God gives to people all they need, and he gives it in abundance, but wasteful extravagance is never right. God's generous giving and our wise use of these things and what he has given of stewardship, they must always go hand in hand. So what about this miracle? How and in what way was it performed? What was the making of this miracle? There are some Christians who read the miracles of Jesus and feel no need to explain them. They are able to simply accept them by faith at face value and remain undisturbed in the simplicity and purity of that faith, which is indeed a wonderful thing. But there are other believers who read such things and their minds question, and they feel they must understand what has actually gone on. And I would say that God understands that type of person, and in truth, in many ways, he steps forward to meet the questioning mind. But in whatever way we approach the miracles of Jesus, one thing is certain. We must never be satisfied to regard them as something which just happened in history. We must always regard them as something which is happening and can happen today and every day. These are not isolated events in history. They are demonstrations of the eternal, operative and available power of Jesus Christ, the power of Holy Spirit. Now there are two ways, maybe more, but two ways that I feel that you can choose to look at this particular miracle, and both of them are miraculous in their own ways. Firstly, you can just choose to look at it as a simple multiplication of loaves and fishes, something which happened once on that day to meet the need of those people on that day, but a miracle nonetheless, but never repeated exactly in the same way. In and of itself, it was an event born out of the need of the crowd on that day. If people view it that way, then we should be content to leave it at that for them. We should not be critical or condemnatory of anyone who believes that and believes that that's all it means. We shouldn't feel compelled to try to make people see it another way. But however, there are many people who, as well as that, they see this miracle as a sacrament. They have felt that those who were present received only the smallest morsel of food, and yet with that they were strengthened for their day and the journey home from it, and they were then satisfied, content. They feel that this is more than just a meal through which people fulfilled their physical appetite, but it was a meal whereby they ate the spiritual food of Christ, so to speak. If that is the view you reach, then this is the first time the miracle is performed, but it also is true every time it's reenacted when we sit together at the Lord's table. At the communion service, Christian believes there comes to us the spiritual food of God, the body and the blood of Christ, which sends the faithful out, enabled to walk the path that God has laid before them, forgiven, strengthened, with firmer feet, so to speak, to walk the path, and greater power to take the journey of life wherever God might want to lead it. And of course, I believe both these perspectives are not mutually exclusive. However, one thing is sure: when Christ is amongst us, the weary do find rest, and the searching, hungry soul is always fed. Okay, folks, we're picking up exactly where we finished last time, and we're going to be looking up at Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Another very famous passage of Scripture in which we see an image of Jesus being available to help those in their hour of trouble, with the words of comfort that he is there and that we should not be afraid. So let me just begin by reading the opening verses for you, verses 22 to 27, which says this: Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid." I believe the lesson of this passage is absolutely clear. But what actually happened and how it happened is perhaps not for some. So first of all, I think it's helpful to do a little scene setting. You'll remember the last couple of days there had been this situation where Jesus had fed this multitude of people, 5,000 men as well as women and children. And after the feeding of this multitude, Jesus sends his disciples away. In fact, this text tells us that he made them, compelled them, it says in translations, to leave on the boat and go on ahead of him. Now, at first sight, this word compelled sounds strange. Why would he so forcefully send them on their way, as it were? Well, if we turn to John's account of this incident, we'll see a little explanation of why perhaps he used these words. It tells us this, that Jesus, after the feeding of the multitude, the crowd wished to come and lay hands on him and make him a king by force. You see, upon Jesus' arrival on the scene, there was a huge surge of popular acclamation and an excited, agitated state spread among the people that the Messiahs arrived, which meant there was a very real possibility that some sort of revolution might begin. The reaction of the people to Jesus was complicated, and many, some would say most, were still thinking in terms of Jesus' arrival wholly in terms of his earthly power. Jesus here sends his disciples away because a situation has arisen which he felt could best be dealt with by diffusing the situation and also dealing with it alone in a sense, in that he would separate himself off from everyone, including his disciples. Because if there was a group of people, he would be much easier to be followed by the crowd, but also because he did not wish his closest disciples to become involved in any what might be perceived as the Romans as a political insurrection, and he simply wanted to be alone with his Father in heaven. And he did manage to do that. He went up to a mountain to pray. So he finally withdrew and got himself where he was alone, up on the top of a mountain to pray, and by this time it tells us that night had come. Now the disciples, they'd set off back across the lake, and one of these sudden storms, for which this lake was notorious, had come down, and suddenly they found themselves struggling against the wind and the waves, and they were actually making little, if any, progress at all across the lake. Sudden gusts of wind and squally storms are very common in the Sea of Galilee. So now there had arisen one of these sudden violent squalls to which, well, not just the Lake of Galilee, that all inland waters around the world, surrounded by hills that are intersected with deep gorges, all water features are liable to great storms in those situations, and that is still the case to this day on the Sea of Galilee. But as the night wore on, we see Jesus begin to walk around the head of the lake in order to reach the other side, one would assume to potentially meet his disciples rowing across the lake. Now Matthew had already told us that when Jesus fed the crowd, he made them sit, and it actually says on the green grass in a literal translation, and from that Bible experts have deduced that these events must have occurred in springtime. Very likely it was very near the Passover time, which was in the middle of April. This would have meant that there would have been a full moon. Also worth noting, a little insight that's within the text, is that the time, in ancient times, in that part of the world at that time, the night was divided into what were called 4 watches. 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to midnight, 12 to 3, and 3 to 6. So it would seem that these events occurred sometime after 3 o'clock in the morning. And Jesus is walking around the higher ground at the north of the lake, coming down from the mountain, and from there he sees the boat fighting with the waves, and he comes down to the shore, one can assume perhaps to help. And remember, the Bible says the reaction of the disciples on seeing this figure gradually appear in their vision, it says, when they saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. A ghost, an apparition, a spectre, as some translations call it. The word is sometimes also rendered spirit. So it seems to me that he would appear to them first like a distant, moving, shadowy object, a spectre almost, first of all appearing to them as if upon the water. But then they would see that this was indeed a human figure emerging from the darkness, walking upon the water. But it's understandable in this situation, in the middle of the night, in the dark, with the storm going on, and a dark, stormy sky creating the backdrop, and not actually realizing that it could be the Lord. In one level, you can say it's understandable that they take it for a spirit or a ghost. But thinking about what that teaches us today, I think it's worth saying that there are times when we find ourselves up against it, that we find ourselves in a desperate struggle, in difficult circumstances, where we seem to be pushing forward and making little progress. Times when our temptations or our sorrows can overtake us, and when our decision-making can become flawed. At such times it's natural to be afraid, and also perhaps to make wrong judgments. But here Jesus Christ comes, which tells me that he came for them that day, and he can come for us. There's no need for us to be alone in our times of struggle. And Jesus comes to them during the storm, and I believe he is willing always to come to us in the storms of life, with, in a sense, a hand stretched out and with a calm voice and a calm word, always bidding us to take heart and to have no fear and to trust in him. This passage is clearly meant to be taken as a sign of a symbol of what the Lord is always willing to do for his people, not just what happened on that day 2,000 years ago. When times are hard for us, when the wind is against us, when we ourselves are in danger of being overwhelmed by the storms of life, he is there. He is always there. And he speaks these words to us also. It is I, be not afraid, the King James says. How often in your life have we really needed to hear him speak those words of encouragement for us? It is I, do not be afraid. It is I, literally, I am. The same language is being used here by Jesus as the language that will be used in Jerusalem when the Pharisees wanted to stone him, because they recognized he was using the identical phrase of the Old Testament to designate himself as the great I am, Jehovah God. The phrase by which God revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush. I am that I am, Exodus 3:14 says. Here I believe Jesus is revealing himself as the great I am, but revealing himself to anyone who is his disciple and anyone who chooses to follow him. It is I am your friend, he says. It is I, do not be afraid, I am your Lord, he says. It is I, the great I am, who is coming to you, the Almighty One. The one in this picture is seen as the one who rules the waves, the one who created the seas and the oceans, but yet still rules the waves, because he is the great I am who made them, and therefore they will obey him. But even in that great revealing of God, we still see a certain loss of faith, but not permanently, temporarily. Let's remind ourselves of what the text says next. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So he said, Come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. I don't think there's any other passage in the New Testament in which Peter's character is more fully, wholly revealed than this. I believe it tells us really important things about him. Firstly, it shows us that Peter was someone who was always given to acting upon insult. He was always acting without thinking about what he was doing. It would be seen to be his pattern again and again. He would say or act without first fully counting the cost, or even understanding sometimes what it was he was doing. He was to do this exact sort of thing when he cut the Roman soldier's ear off in the garden when they came to arrest Jesus. Or, probably most dramatically, when one moment he was affirming undying and unshakable loyalty to Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, verses 33 to 35, and then he denies the Lord's name a few verses later 3 times. But yet, friends, there are worse sins than the sins of Peter. Peter's only trouble in reality was the fact that he was ruled by his heart. And although he might sometimes slip up, he might fail, his motivation was nearly always coming from the right place, and the instinct of his heart was always his love for the Lord. And like all of us, he would occasionally be overtaken by fear or anger. So there's a lot we can learn and be comforted by this. Because it says that although Peter acted on impulse, it often shows us that even though he often failed and came to grief, he would often thereafter reach out to the Lord again. It is always Jesus' perspective that we should not make those mistakes of Peter, that we should try as best we can look at every situation realistically, even if sometimes it appears bleak, but we should look at it full in the face, prayerfully, trustfully before we act. Peter's acts did not always turn out to be acts of faith. What Peter did, not always born out of a great faith in the Lord. He was sometime moved by his fears and his doubts. But on the other side of that coin, what we can learn from this is that true faith never attempts to do amazing things merely for the sake of doing them. It is a fact that ought to be noted that the gospel narrates the failures of the individuals within it, the followers of Jesus. Yes, it does demonstrate the miraculous power of the Lord, and on the part of the apostles at time as well, and those who were their successors. And it's interesting to me that no other book, religious book, or even books of myth choose to do this. They always want to make the hero appear a hero. But the difference in these gospel accounts, we see real people driven by real fears and real emotions, and it is always made plain why they failed. Jesus, all throughout his ministry, was completely honest with people. In fact, you could say he was warning us and trying to get us to a point where we'd understand how difficult it could be to follow him sometimes. You know, a great deal of Christian failure is due to acting upon an emotional moment rather than praying and weighing the situation first, or even counting the cost of the decision we make, because then it does not trip us up or surprise us when it happens. And finally, I think it tells us that Peter, like all of us, can get there in the end. He never ultimately failed, for always in the moment of his breakdown, he was always in a sense clutching out, reaching out for Christ. The wonderful thing about him is that every time he fell, he always rose again. He always got up again. And ultimately, even his failures brought him closer to the Lord. And in life, even our failures and our mistakes, if we acknowledge them and bring them to the Lord and gain insights from them, they can bring us closer to him. It has been well said by many before me that a Christian is not someone who never fails. A Christian is someone who repents and gets up and goes on again every time he fails. A Christian is not someone who never sins, but is simply someone who sins and chooses to repent and then move forward again. Ultimately, Peter's failures only made him love Jesus Christ and depend on him more. These verses finish by depicting another great and eternal truth. The fact that when Jesus got into the boat, the wind reduced. And that tells me a great truth that we must acknowledge here and try as best we can apply it in our own lives, is that whenever we draw Christ into these situations, then the wildest storms of life that we might be facing can become calm. Reading from the letters of Francis of Assisi, we discover Francis noticed a certain custom in the district of the country in which he was living at that time. He noticed that one day a young farm servant, he noticed that she would go across the farmyard every day to draw water at the well. He also noticed that before she lifted the pail out of the well, she put 2 flat pieces of wood across it and threw the rope. And one day he went to the girl and asked her, "Why do you do that?" She looked surprised and answered as if this was just common sense, because she'd done it all his life. "Why," she said, "it keeps the water from spilling. It keeps it steady." Writing to a friend later, he used this story as an illustration and noted that when the heart is distressed and agitated, if we too put the cross at its centre, it will keep it steady. In every storm and stress of life, the presence of Christ and the love of Christ, which ultimately flows out from the cross, will bring peace and serenity and calm. Okay, let's just close off this passage and read the last few verses. When we see the crowd still following and many come before him to touch him, and indeed many are, in fact, made well. It says, "When they crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all the surrounding region and brought to him all who were sick. And they begged him that they might touch the hem of his garment, and as many touched it were made perfectly well." Now this is just a small connecting passage marking the end of this section and a new one starting. It's only a sentence or two in this gospel story, and it would be very easy to pass over it and not recognize its importance and what it reveals about Jesus and the crowds that might appear at times to follow him. Firstly, it obviously shows that no sooner did Jesus appear again that everywhere people started crowding around him again and clamoring for help, and that he never refused it. It says he healed them all. There's no evidence here of him preaching or teaching at any length. It's simply a record that he goes around and people throw themselves at him and that he heals many. But the most tremendous thing about this, I think, is the fact that Jesus is seen to not only teach people by what he says, but he teaches them what God is like by showing them what God is like. He did not just tell them that God cared through stories and parable. He showed them that God cares. And it seems to me that still today there's little use of talking or preaching about the love of God in words alone without showing the love of God in our actions as churches and communities and individuals. But there is also a great anguish, a great sadness to be seen here if we look at this passage carefully. You should not read this passage without recognizing the grim truth that there were hundreds and thousands of people who desired Jesus, but ultimately it would be seen that they would only desire him for what they could get out of him. For in spite of all these crowds today, the crowd would ultimately turn against him, and in a frighteningly short period of time. Once many had received their healing, the thing which they sought, they were not really prepared to go any further with it, to take the situation any further. And I suppose it's always been the case. People often want the blessings of Christianity or the accoutrements and the attributes of a religious Christian life without recognizing its responsibilities and the call it makes upon us and our lives. It has always been the case that many people will only come before God or even remember God when they have need of him. Ingratitude towards God and towards Christ is probably the worst of all sins, and there's probably no sin of which men and women are more often and more consistently guilty. Yet he still knows that, and yet he still continues to offer all of us forgiveness and reconciliation in spite of our flaws. Okay, friends, we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up exactly where we left off next time. I do hope you're finding our time together helpful, and you're blessed by it.